The late afternoon sun cast long, distorted shadows across the asphalt of the old industrial access road, a stretch of highway notorious not for its traffic, but for its strategic isolation. It was here that Captain Moraes and Officer Ribeiro had established their unauthorized checkpoint. To the casual observer, the placement of the patrol car, partially concealed behind a dense cluster of billboards, might have seemed like a tactical error. But it was a calculated predator's blind. They were not looking for high-profile criminals or dangerous fugitives. Such arrests required paperwork, media attention, and scrutiny. Instead, they were hunting for the vulnerable. Drivers in older vehicles, those who looked tired, those who would likely pay a fine on the spot rather than face the bureaucratic nightmare of a towed vehicle. The air inside their cruiser was stale, filled with the quiet boredom of men who had long ago traded their oath of service for the convenience of petty tyranny. The target appeared on the horizon, a modest grey sedan, perfectly average in every way. It was moving at a strictly legal speed, maintaining a steady lane position that suggested a driver of caution and experience. To Moraes, however, this signaled weakness. He signaled to Ribeiro, who engaged the sirens with a practiced flick of the wrist. The sudden wail of the siren shattered the quiet of the desolate road, and the flashing red and blue lights painted the surrounding dust in violent strobes. The grey sedan did not panic or swerve. It simply signaled and pulled over to the shoulder with a precision that should have alerted the officers that this was not a standard civilian panic reaction. But confirmation bias is a blinding force. The officers saw only an old car and an elderly woman behind the wheel, the perfect ingredients for a quick, undocumented settlement. Ribeiro approached the driver's side, his hand resting theatrically on his holster, a posture designed to instill fear before a word was even spoken. Inside the vehicle sat Dona Lucia Souza. She was a woman of advanced age, her hair tied back in a severe, practical bun, her hands resting at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel. She did not look at the officer with the trembling anxiety they were accustomed to. Instead, her gaze was fixed forward, waiting for the tap on the glass. When the command came to lower the window, she complied smoothly. The interior of her car was immaculate, free of the clutter that usually defined the vehicles of the working class they targeted. The officer demanded her documents with a tone that bordered on a shout, despite being inches from her face. Lucia produced her license and registration with calm efficiency. Everything was in order. The tax was paid, the inspection was current, and her license had no points. This perfection irritated Moraes, who was watching from the other side of the vehicle. A clean driver meant they had no leverage. They circled the car, looking for a bald tire, a broken light, anything that could be leveraged into a threat of seizure. Finding nothing, the atmosphere shifted from professional pretense to palpable aggression. They could not let a target leave without a cost. It undermined the authority they believed they wielded over this stretch of road. Moraes leaned into the window, deciding to manufacture the conflict they needed. He accused her of swerving prior to the stop, a fabrication so blatant it hung in the air like a bad smell. When Lucia remained silent, offering no apology for a mistake she hadn't made, the captain's ego flared. He interpreted her silence not as discipline, but as arrogance. He escalated the situation, claiming her attitude constituted disrespect towards an officer of the law. The vague and malleable charge of desacato, contempt of authority, was their favorite weapon. It required no physical evidence, only the word of a badge against the word of a citizen. With a sharp gesture, they ordered her out of the vehicle. For a woman of her age, the command was physically demanding, yet Lucia exited the car with a stiffness that spoke of age, but a posture that spoke of immense dignity. She stood by the roadside, the wind whipping at her clothes, as Ribeiro twisted her arm behind her back with unnecessary force. The metal of the handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists, a sound that usually signaled the breaking of a person's spirit. But Lucia did not cry out. She did not beg for leniency or offer them money to let her go. Instead, she watched. Her eyes, sharp and clear, tracked the movement of every finger, every glance between the partners. She focused on the metallic nameplate pinned to the captain's chest. Moraes. She shifted her gaze to the shoulder patch of the younger officer. Ribeiro. She memorized the unit number painted on the side of the patrol car. In her mind, she was cataloguing the sequence of events with the precision of a black box recorder. She noted the time, the location, and the complete absence of due process. To the officers, her silence was submission. They had no idea that her lack of verbal resistance was a tactical choice, a discipline honed by decades of proximity to the highest echelons of military protocol. They shoved her into the back of the patrol car, the hard plastic seat unforgiving against her restrained frame. As the heavy door slammed shut, separating her from the outside world, the officers returned to the front seats. Laughing, the tension of the confrontation evaporated instantly for them, replaced by the adrenaline of the power trip. They joked about the paperwork, already planning how they would frame the narrative in the report. A belligerent old woman who refused to comply with lawful orders. They felt invincible, insulated by the badge and the isolation of the location. The engine roared to life, and the cruiser pulled a U-turn, kicking up gravel as it headed back toward the district precinct. Lucia sat in the back, the handcuffs digging into her skin, her body swaying with the motion of the car. She looked through the wire mesh separating her from her captors, listening to their casual conversation about dinner plans and sports. Completely oblivious to the gravity of the mistake they had just made, they saw a helpless pensioner in the rearview mirror. They did not see the storm gathering on the horizon. As the precinct came into view, a fortress of peeling paint and bureaucratic apathy, Lucia took a deep, steadying breath, preparing herself for the next phase of an ordeal that was about to shift from a traffic stop into something entirely different. The transition from the sterile enclosure of the patrol car to the chaotic interior of the district precinct was abrupt and disorienting. The station was a hive of low-level bureaucratic activity, smelling faintly of stale coffee, floor wax, and the accumulated misery of 1,000 bad nights. Captain Moraes and Officer Ribeiro ushered Dona Lucia through the main entrance with a theatrical roughness, parading their arrest before the desk sergeant and the few other officers present. To them, she was a trophy of their authority, a symbol that no one, not even a respectable-looking grandmother, was exempt from their interpretation of the law. They placed her in a metal chair bolted to the floor in a designated holding area, a spot usually reserved for drunkards and petty thieves. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, with an irritating flicker, casting a sickly pallor over the room, but Lucia sat with a spinal alignment that suggested she was sitting in a cathedral rather than a cage. While Lucia maintained her vigil, Moraes sat at a cluttered desk, cracking his knuckles before beginning the creative writing exercise that was the police report. He typed with 2 fingers, hunting and pecking for the keys that would seal the narrative. In his version of events, the elderly woman had been erratic, verbally, abusive and physically threatening. He embellished the story with standard phrases designed to protect the department from liability. Active resistance, risk to public safety, and necessary use of restraining force. Ribeiro leaned against the desk, chuckling as he added suggestions, ensuring that the fabricated charges of contempt were heavy enough to justify a night in a cell and a substantial fine, but vague enough to be dismissed later if she hired a decent lawyer. It was a racket they had perfected over years a cycle of intimidation and extortion that relied entirely on the victim's fear. After nearly 45 minutes of processing, a deliberate delay intended to increase the detainee's anxiety, Ribeiro approached Lucia with a wireless handset. He informed her with a sneer disguised as politeness that she was granted her one phone call. The officers exchanged knowing glances, expecting the usual frantic plea to a confused spouse or the desperate search for a bail bondsman. They anticipated tears, trembling hands, and the satisfying sound of a spirit breaking. Ribeiro held the phone out, almost taunting her with it, expecting her to snatch it in desperation. Lucia accepted the device with slow, deliberate movements. She did not scroll through contacts or ask for a phone book. Instead, she dialed a number from memory, a sequence of digits that did not follow the standard local formatting. She turned slightly away from the officers, not to hide her tears, but to shield her voice from the casual eavesdropping of the room. There was no greeting, no hello, and no explanation of her whereabouts. Into the receiver, she spoke with a low, clipped precision. She recited a string of alphanumeric characters, followed by her location coordinates and a specific authorization code that hadn't been used in a civilian context in decades. The conversation was entirely one-sided. She listened for a brief acknowledgement on the other end, her face an unreadable mask, and then ended the call. The entire interaction lasted less than 30 seconds. She handed the phone back to a bewildered Ribeiro. The brevity of the call confused the officers. In their experience, panic was verbose. People begged, they screamed, they tried to explain everything at once. Silence and brevity were foreign concepts in this room. Mariah scoffed, loudly speculating that whoever she called had hung up on her, or that she was too ashamed to tell her family what she had done. They interpreted her stoicism as the shock of abandonment. Lucia simply returned to her seat, crossed her hands in her lap, and closed her eyes for a moment, appearing to meditate amidst the chaos of the station. Back at the desk, the officers finalized the paperwork, printing 3 copies of the lies that would define Lucia's record. They were so absorbed in their administrative fabrication that they failed to notice the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. It started with the background noise. The constant, rhythmic chatter of the police radio dispatch, a sound so ubiquitous it usually faded into white noise, suddenly cut out. It wasn't a gradual fade, but a hard stop, replaced by a sharp, rhythmic static that pulsed with an unnatural consistency. Simultaneously, the landline phone on the sergeant's desk, which had been ringing incessantly all evening, fell silent. One of the younger officers behind the counter picked up the receiver, tapped the cradle, and shook his head, looking at the cord as if checking for a physical break. He tried to dial out, but the line was dead. A few feet away, another officer pulled his personal cell phone from his pocket, frowning at the screen as he walked toward the window, searching for a signal that had mysteriously evaporated. The Wi-Fi indicator on the station's computer terminals blinked out, leaving the screens frozen on loading bars. Moraes looked up from his report, finally sensing that the stillness was artificial. The station hadn't just lost power. The lights were still humming. It was as if the precinct had been severed from the rest of the world electronically. He looked over at Lucia. She was no longer looking at the floor. Her head was raised, her eyes fixed on the heavy glass doors of the station entrance. She wasn't waiting for a lawyer. She was waiting for a response time. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with an invisible pressure, as the realization began to dawn on the officers that the silence wasn't a technical glitch, but a prelude to something arriving from the darkness outside. The unnatural silence that had descended upon the district precinct was not merely an absence of noise. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to press against the eardrums of every officer in the room. The phones were dead, the computers frozen, and the radios emitted only a rhythmic, mocking static. But this electronic void was short-lived, broken not by the return of a dial tone, but by a physical sensation that started in the soles of their feet. It was a low-frequency rumble, a vibration that shook the loose pens on the desks and rattled the glass within the window frames. It was the distinct, guttural growl of heavy diesel engines, not the high-pitched whine of civilian traffic or the familiar siren of a patrol car, but the deep, mechanical roar of military-grade transport. Captain Moraes was the first to move, abandoning his fabricated report to approach the front window. He peered through the dirty blinds, expecting perhaps a construction crew or a large delivery truck. What he saw caused the blood to drain from his face, leaving him pale and rigid. The street outside, usually a thoroughfare for local traffic, had been completely erased from view by a wall of steel and camouflage. Two massive troop transport trucks bearing the unmistakable olive-drab livery of the Brazilian army had pulled up directly in front of the station, effectively blockading the main entrance. Flanking them were several matte black SUVs with tinted windows and federal government plates, their lights flashing in a silent, synchronized rhythm that signaled a high-level tactical operation. The transformation of the street was instantaneous and absolute. Within seconds, the casual, chaotic flow of the city was replaced by a rigid grid of tactical dominance. Soldiers spilled from the rear of the trucks, not with the hurried frenzy of a sudden response, but with the fluid, practiced precision of a unit that had drilled this maneuver 1,000 times. They wore full tactical gear, their faces obscured by balaclavas, their uniforms bearing the insignias of the Army Police and the specialized tactical units of the Military Public Ministry. They moved in silence, communicating with sharp hand signals, establishing a perimeter that extended far beyond the station's front steps. The solitary guard posted outside the station, a young officer who had been smoking a cigarette and, leaning against a pillar, was disarmed and neutralized with professional efficiency before he could even reach for his radio. He was not harmed, but he was firmly escorted away from his post, his weapon secured by a federal agent, rendering the precinct's outer defense non-existent. Inside the station, the atmosphere shifted from confusion to primal fear. Officer Ribeiro, who minutes ago had been laughing at the helpless old woman, now found his hands shaking uncontrollably as he reached for his service weapon, a reflex born of panic rather than strategy. He stopped halfway, realizing the futility of the gesture. Through the glass, he could see the red laser sights dancing across the precinct's lobby, painting the walls and the chests of the corrupt officers with small, trembling dots of light. The message was clear. Any resistance would be met with overwhelming force. This was not a negotiation, it was a takeover. The hierarchy of the local police, usually the supreme authority in this district, had been instantly rendered obsolete by a power far greater and infinitely more disciplined. Dona Lucia Souza remained seated in the metal chair, her posture unchanged. She did not look at the window. She did not need to. She knew exactly what was happening outside. She recognized the sound of the engines, the cadence of the boots hitting the pavement, and the specific shift in air pressure that occurs when a space is secured by military forces. For the first time since her arrest, a faint, almost imperceptible calmness settled over her features. She was no longer a detainee. She was the anchor point of a rescue mission executed with the severity of a counter-terrorism strike. The officers around her, however, were beginning to unravel. They looked at each other, desperate for orders, but Captain Moraes was paralyzed, his mind unable to bridge the gap between the petty extortionist he was and the federal target he had unknowingly become. The front doors of the precinct did not open. They were breached. A team of federal agents, led by military police officers, swept into the lobby. "Federal operation! Hands visible! Now!" The command was barked with a volume and authority that shattered the remaining tension. There was no room for interpretation. Every officer in the room, including the desk sergeant and the administrative staff, instinctively raised their hands, backing away from their desks. The invaders moved with a terrifying speed, securing the room sector by sector, checking corners, and disarming the local police as if they were hostile combatants. The disconnect was jarring. Law enforcement officers were being taken down by other law enforcement officers, exposing the deep fracture between those who upheld the law and those who twisted it for profit. Moraes and Ribeiro were singled out. A team of 3 tactical operators advanced on them, their weapons held at the low-ready position. The corrupt officers were spun around, pushed against the very desk where they had been writing their lies, and patted down with aggressive thoroughness. Their badges were ripped from their uniforms, a symbolic stripping of authority that stung more than the physical handling. They were not read their rights immediately. The priority was securing the scene. The station was now under federal jurisdiction. The files, the computers, the evidence locker, everything was now the property of the military public ministry. The local corruption ecosystem, which had thrived in the dark for years, was being flooded with the blinding light of accountability. As the chaos of the breach settled into a controlled occupation, the sea of tactical gear parted near the entrance. The frenetic energy of the assault team gave way to a respectful stillness. A figure emerged from the threshold, framed by the flashing lights of the convoy outside. The silhouette was imposing, dressed not in tactical assault gear, but in the immaculate high-ranking service uniform of a general of the army. The polished boots echoed on the linoleum floor, a slow, deliberate cadence that drew every eye in the room. The gold stars on the shoulders caught the harsh fluorescent light, signaling a rank that demanded absolute obedience. The general did not look at the cowering officers. The gaze was fixed solely on the elderly woman sitting in the holding area. The soldiers standing guard near Lucia snapped to attention, saluting with sharp precision as the commander approached. It was a surreal juxtaposition, the highest level of military command paying respects in a dirty district precinct. Captain Moraes, pressed against his desk with his face turned sideways, watched with widening eyes as the realization finally hit him with the force of a physical blow. The resemblance was undeniable, the set of the jaw, the steel in the eyes, the dignified posture. The general was a younger, more formidable mirror image of the woman he had handcuffed. He had not just arrested a pensioner, he had declared war on the matriarch of a dynasty he couldn't begin to comprehend. The general stopped a few feet from the chair. The room fell into a deathly silence, the only sound the heavy breathing of the detained officers. The general slowly removed the uniform cap, tucking it under one arm, and looked down at Lucia. There were no hysterics, no weeping reunion. Instead, there was a silent exchange of understanding, a communication of shared relief and steely resolve. The general signaled to a subordinate who stepped forward with a key, not the standard precinct key, but a universal cutter to bypass the local restraints if necessary. However, the keys on Moraes's belt were confiscated and handed over. As the metal cuffs were unlocked and fell away from Lucia's wrists, the sound of the metal hitting the floor seemed to echo like a gavel strike. Lucia rubbed her wrists, stood up, and looked at the general. She nodded once, a gesture that conveyed that she was unharmed, but that the debt had to be paid. The general turned then slowly, pivoting on a heel to face the room. The expression on the commander's face was terrifyingly blank, devoid of anger, but filled with a cold, calculating judgment. The eyes swept over the room and landed on Moraes and Ribeiro, who were now trembling visibly. The general did not speak to them, but simply raised a hand, pointing a gloved finger at the 2 men, then toward the door where the federal transport vehicles waited. It was a silent order for the next phase of the operation to begin, a phase that would go far beyond a simple rescue. The investigation had just gone live, and the evidence was standing right in front of them. The silence that had gripped the precinct following General Adriana Souza's silent command was not a pause in the action, but a heavy, suffocating interlude before the final dismantling of a criminal enterprise. The general did not need to shout. The weight of the moment was amplified by the sheer disparity in power between the corrupt officers and the force that now occupied their station. At a sharp hand signal from the general, the tactical teams shifted from containment to processing. This was no longer a rescue mission. It was the execution of a federal warrant that had been months in the making. The rescue of Donna Lucia was merely the catalyst that accelerated the timeline of Operation Ironclad, a secret investigation that the local police had been entirely oblivious to. Captain Moraes and Officer Ribeiro, stripped of their belts and badges, were hoisted from their chairs not by their local colleagues, but by federal agents who treated them with the clinical detachment reserved for high-value targets. They were not placed in the holding cells they had used to terrorize civilians. Instead, they were seated at their own desks, which had been transformed into interrogation stations. The irony was palpable. The very instruments of their bureaucratic abuse, the computers, the logbooks, the fabricated quota sheets, were now being seized as evidence against them. Forensic specialists from the military public ministry began to scour the room, tagging hard drives and seizing physical files with a speed that suggested they knew exactly where to look. It became terrifyingly clear to Moraes that the federal government hadn't just stumbled upon this precinct. They had been watching it. As the physical processing continued, General Souza remained, standing by her mother. There was a brief, unspoken exchange between them, a subtle nod from Lucia that confirmed she was physically unhurt, followed by a slight softening of the general's steel gaze. However, the professional mask returned instantly. The general motioned for a briefing officer to step forward. A tactical map was unrolled across the sergeant's desk, covering the falsified reports. The map detailed not just the precinct, but a complex web of financial transactions and communication nodes, linking this specific police unit to a much larger, darker entity. The officers, forced to watch, realized with dawning horror that their off-the-books stops and extortion schemes were not isolated incidents of petty greed, but documented nodes in a federal case file. The true scope of the disaster was revealed as the lead investigator began to lay out the evidence, speaking in a low, factual tone that carried across the quiet room. The investigation had not started with Lucia. It had begun 6 months prior, triggered by anomalies in the district's asset forfeiture reports and a pattern of civil rights violations that pointed to a coordinated effort to suppress specific voters and extort local business owners. The quotas Moraes and Ribeiro were so desperate to fill were not for the department. They were collection targets for a shadow payroll. The investigation had mapped the flow of illicit funds from these roadside shakedowns directly into the coffers of a political campaign. The name Vereador Couto, Councilman Couto, was written in red at the top of the organizational chart. The officers' blood ran cold. They had believed they were protected by Couto's political influence, that he was their shield against scrutiny. They had not realized they were merely his disposable tools. The general's presence here confirmed that the shield had been shattered. The arrest of the general's mother had provided the final, undeniable link, the flagrante delicto of abuse of power that allowed the military to intervene under the provision of guaranteeing law and order, bypassing the local political obstructors who had stalled the investigation for weeks. Lucia had not just been a victim. Her presence in the system had acted as a tracer dye, illuminating the rot from the inside out. Suddenly, the static on the federal radios broke with a crisp, clear transmission. Team Alpha reports target secure. The councilman is in custody. The message echoed through. the precinct, sealing the fate of everyone in the room. The raid on the precinct had been synchronized with a simultaneous strike on Councilman Couteau's private residence and his legislative office. The radio operator confirmed that significant evidence, including the parallel ledgers matching the precinct's extortion dates, had been secured at the politician's home. The protection Moraes thought he had was gone. The political patron who was supposed to make this disappear was now sitting in the back of a federal vehicle, likely already negotiating a plea deal that would trade the small fish, the police officers, for leniency. With the primary target secured and the digital evidence mirrored, the tone in the room shifted to finality. General Souza turned her attention back to the corrupt officers. She did not lecture them on honor or duty. Their actions had already proven they understood neither. Instead, she gestured to the federal agents. Moraes and Ribeiro were hauled to their feet, their hands cuffed behind their backs with heavy-duty zip ties. The arrogance that had defined their behavior on the roadside was entirely extinguished, replaced by the hollow, thousand-yard stare of men who realized their lives as they knew them were over. They were facing charges of kidnapping, extortion, abuse of authority, and conspiracy against the state. Charges that would be tried in federal and military courts, far away from the local judges they might have been able to bribe. The procession out of the station was a stark reversal of the entry. General Souza and Dona Lucia led the way, walking side by side. Lucia walked with the same dignity she had maintained during her arrest, her head held high, her wrists bruised, but her spirit untouched. The general walked with the precise, measured stride of a commander who had successfully neutralized a threat to the Republic. They stepped out into the night air, which was now filled with the flashing lights of the convoy and the flashes of cameras from the press who had been tipped off about the raid on the councilman and had followed the military vehicles. Behind them, the corrupt officers were marched out, flanked by armed soldiers. The flashbulbs captured their faces, pale, sweaty, and defeated. The contrast was brutal and necessary. The image of the general and her mother, framed by the machinery of justice, stood in sharp relief against the image of the disgraced officers being loaded into the back of a prisoner transport truck, the very same type of vehicle they had threatened to put innocent citizens in. As the convoy prepared to depart, the general paused at the door of her armored SUV. She looked back at the precinct one last time. The local sign was still above the door, but the federal agents were already sealing the entrance with yellow tape. The station was now a crime scene. The message had been delivered, not just to Moraes and Ribeiro, but to every corrupt element hiding within the system. There were lines that could not be crossed, and there were forces watching in the shadows, ready to bring the full weight of the state crashing down on those who betrayed their oath. Lucia climbed into the passenger seat of the general's vehicle, the heavy door closing with a solid, reassuring thud that shut out the noise of the press and the sirens. The interior was quiet and secure. The general climbed in beside her driver, and with a signal, the massive engine roared to life. The convoy began to move, rolling away from the scene of the trap that had sprung so spectacularly shut. The investigation was closed, the corruption ring was decapitated, and as the taillights of the military column faded into the city traffic, the street was left empty, save for the cautionary tale etched into the history of the district. The day the wolves made the mistake of hunting a lioness.